The Israelis attacked Iran on the basis of preemptive defense. So, and Nelson Mandela put it very well at one time when he was confronted with this question. He says, these fellows, when they don't want you under your freedom fighter, they call you a terrorist. And yet, the truth is, all freedom fighters are labeled terrorists because the Western world long recognized if you want to kill a dog, you give it a bad name, then you proceed to kill it. So from where I sit, there is nothing that is happening that is bad from Russia. The only thing is we must agree. War is a bad thing. It is a bad thing because young men and women die. The situation between Israel and Iran is one that poses very many questions and does not lend itself to easy answers. And in my view, must be situated in the context of history. If you look at Iran, the Iran that we know now, we've got to go back to the 1920s when the Reza Pahlavi family became the dominating dynasty until the Reza Pahlavi was removed in 1941 by the Allied powers, the British and the Soviet Union, for being not willing to do their bidding. But he was then succeeded by his son, Mohammad Shah Reza Pahlavi, who liberalized Iran in many ways and who was very compliant with the West. And of course, that then led to the emergence of the Ayatollahs, and culminating in the 1979 emergence of the Ayatollahs and the abolition of the Pahlavi dynasty. And something begins to happen at that time because the Ayatollahs come in with a theocratic regime which clearly states that they do not recognize the state of Israel, and that in fact the state of Israel must be wiped off the surface of the earth. And they say that this Zionist regime must actually go. So that is the official stated position of the Iran regime or the Tehran regime. And the fact that then they started enriching uranium, almost reaching weapon-grade enrichment, then raised alarm, particularly in the United States of America and in Israel. And the argument that is being put forth by the Netanyahu regime is that they have credible evidence, or that they had credible evidence that the Iranians had crossed the red line in terms of enrichment, and that they cannot allow the regime to have a nuclear weapon. It is instructive that at the time when the attack on Iran took place, there was a diplomatic effort, or there were diplomatic efforts which were being mediated in Saudi Arabia and within that particular environment with a view to convincing the Iranians that they ought not to use the uranium for non-peaceful purposes. And to the casual observers, like all of us, we thought that they were going on very well. At least when you listen to the President of the United States of America, one took the view that the negotiations would give birth to a result which would be acceptable to all, and the International Atomic Energy was supervising. But for some reason, in what in the eyes of many, appears to be a unilateral decision by the Israelis. But what we now know, had the nod of the United States of America, there is a conflagration which has resulted in a tit for tat and which is affecting populations. We have seen in the last one week the Israelis saying that they now have air domination over the whole of Tehran. We have seen the use of hypersonic missiles which have hit Tel Aviv and have hit Haifa. And for the first time, we see a disruption of normal life in Israel, which had not taken place during the conflict in Gaza, and even when the Houthis were launching their ballistic missiles from Yemen. The question is, should the world be worried? Yes, the world should be worried. The world should be worried because there is a powder keg. What one fears is that if indeed you are to hit some of the bunkers where the enriched uranium is stored, what would be the impact in terms of the pollution that would take place? Who else will be drawn into the conflict? Remember that the Tehran regime has a satellite or what one would call client organization that work with it or work for it. You talk about the Houthis, and that is in Yemen. You talk about the Hezbollah in Syria and in Lebanon. What will they do? And one can also not discount what is being heard in the grapevine, that the North Koreans have said, we are ready to help. The Chinese are also said to be said, we are ready to help, even if it is in a subterranean manner. And the United States of America thus far has not entered into the conflict directly, but we know that their military assets are moving closer and closer to the theater of war. So if those are the early signs of a war that is big, of course, I'm one who is slow to use the term world war, but there are those who are already saying that these are the early signs of a third world war. But I would be much more hesitant because one can see that there are voices in different parts of the world that are calling on Israel and calling on Iran to step back and ask themselves what value is going to be achieved if the conflagration continues in the manner that it is. But as the saying goes, the jury is still out, there is a tit for tat, and there are internal contradictions, both in Israel and in Iran. In Iran, there are segments of the population who are anti the theocratic regime of the Ayatollahs, and they possibly think that this is an opportunity for regime change. Within Israel, there are those who are fatigued that there is little economic activity that is taking place in different parts of Israel. We know that Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv is almost out of commission or is under constant danger. A number of airlines are no longer flying to Tel Aviv. So all these factors conjoined is sending an unequivocal message to the players that diplomacy should be given its pride of place. As to whether that will happen is another debate. But I would want to imagine, as other commentators are saying, that it is critical that the United States of America enters into the arena of diplomacy because they had initiated these negotiations, that if indeed they did so, then there would be a ceasefire, and that would create an environment where the parties who are actively in the theater of war would reassess their positions going forward. You know, it is a very complex situation. I have had an argument being put forth that the Iranians were going on with enrichment, all the negotiations notwithstanding. that the Iranians were not responding to the ultimatum that was given by the United States of America, and the President of the United States of America has actually said we gave them 60 days, and it's on the 61st day that we saw Israel do what they did. And further, it is also being said that they were engaged in proxy activities through the Houthis and even through Hezbollah. So what changed? I think a number of things changed, but as one must always do, is to look at the history of it. What is the history of it? That there are geopolitical reasons why the United States of America, which until a few years ago has been the hegemon, would want to ensure that it does not lose its foothold in that region, and that they would not allow a regime which they consider to be rogue in Tehran to have a military that has in its arsenal a nuclear device. So I think that when all these things were assessed, the Israelis must have received the green light. You go and test the waters. And it is also possible that the Israelis, when they entered into this arena, did not imagine that the response would be like it is. And right now, it is, as Shakespeare once said, that they have waded so deep into blood that to go forth is as tedious as to go back. And they find themselves between the devil and the deep blue sea in a catch-22 situation. The question is, what do you do? And that is why I think, therefore, that the voice, for example, of the United Nations, for whatever it is worth, because the United Nations now has become such a weak organization whose resolutions are honored in breach, and other players that are interested in this particular situation. So there are many moving parts in this particular situation. And those parts are such as to send danger signs to America and to Israel, and they could wait no more. But we cannot forget that there are other activities that are going on in the world. One cannot forget that there is activity between Russia and Ukraine. One cannot forget that there are activities within the Middle East, as it is called now. One cannot forget that there is a rising power in China, and that all these factors are also making the United States a little bit worried, and they do not want a clan state, if one may, of a side that is not their own. And remember, at one time, Benjamin Netanyahu is on record as saying that Israel is the largest warship for the United States of America in the Middle East. It is a stationary warship from which you can launch many things and neutralize enemies, real or perceived. And I think that their own assessment must have told them that even internally, the Ayatollahs are very weak, and to weaken them now would lead to a regime change. I think there is appetite for diplomacy in the region. There is fatigue. The populations are tired. And we know that the Russian administration, led by Vladimir Putin, has a soft heart for the Iranian administration. We know that the Chinese have a soft heart for the Iranian administration. We also are aware that the North Koreans have a soft heart for the Iranian administration. If soft-heartedness is equal to being allies, then they are in that region. But we also know, on the other hand, that the state of Israel is almost seen as a pariah state in that neighborhood, and that the only friend they have, real friend, if you may, is the United States of America. because even Europe has been sending very clear messages to Europe, particularly the Portuguese have spoken, the Spaniards have spoken, the French not as loudly as they should, the Germans have historical baggages so they can't speak about and against Israel. And they are sending one message: don't fight wars on too many fronts. You are fighting in Gaza, you are fighting the Houthis, you are fighting Hezbollah in Lebanon, you are fighting everybody. You can't do this on too many fronts. Whether those messages, blatant and subtle, are being listened to is a totally different debate. But I think that there is the danger which is being seen by the international community. Already we have seen the impact of this particular conflict on the price of oil. And when you talk about the price of oil, everybody is affected. And we also know that that is a very busy area for shipping. So that in terms of the economic impact, the insurance companies all over Europe are beginning to suffer, and the international value chain and food chain, if you may, is being disrupted. So for all those reasons, you can see that there is appetite to ensure that there is a diplomatic solution. You can see the Saudis are making their voices heard, the Qataris are making their voices heard, and all reasonable commentators are sending one clear message: really, let's not continue with this. It can't be resolved otherwise. The situation in the Middle East, and particularly in the context of what is happening now, is dicey. And it is true that from a military perspective, at the end of this particular exercise, when and if there is a ceasefire, commentators will say, but Israel has won anyway. But it is Pyrrhic victory. The cost of that victory, in my view, will be too high. Too high in what sense? Too high because you live in a neighborhood where everybody wants to strangle you. You live in a neighborhood where you cannot do business with your immediate neighbors. And that is not the kind of neighborhood that one wants. It is already a tough neighborhood, even without the war. But remember now that you have a neighborhood where your internal population, you have Hamas, whether you have killed all their leaders, children and women and families have been wiped out, and they exist for only one reason: revenge. You now have an extended enemy outside 1,000 kilometers away in Iran. You have enemies in Yemen. You have enemies in Saudi Arabia. So it will be, as I've already indicated, a Pyrrhic victory whose cost is too much. And one would have thought, for example, that this was the period for rapprochement, particularly with the new administration in Syria, which administration was already beginning to say that we are going to normalize our relationship with Israel. One would have thought that that would be the direction that the entire Middle East region would take towards Israel. One would have thought, for example, that in the context of the negotiations between Iran and the United States of America, the Iranian administration would have been persuaded to recognize the state of Israel and to drop this approach where they said that they must wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So all those things only tell me one thing: that the cost of victory, however defined by whichever side, is too expensive and will create an environment which will live with us for generations and generations. When you listen, and I'm a keen listener of both Western press and Western commentators, and on the other side, the Eastern, and there is one thing that must always be remembered, that the conceptual West always drives the narrative. The major news outlets that are listened to by most of the world, whether it is Bloomberg or CNN, or Radio France, or Radio Deutsche Welle, or Sky or BBC have only one narrative, and that narrative is that they are good and bad guys, and that we are the good guys. We are the ones who should define morality for the world. What we say is good, what we say is bad is bad. So when we say that the Russians are bad, then the world should simply say, yes, sir, yes, madam, they are bad, very bad. But they have short and selective memories, because they must remember, in the case of Russia, for example, that in 1990 they say not an inch more. But they have now conveniently forgotten that. They have forgotten it in their spaces of power, in their analysis, in their writings, and they now ask the question, well, where was it written? So they drive the narrative. And it can no longer be denied, for example, that Ukraine is fighting a proxy war. We now know, and there is evidence to demonstrate, and we have listened to the British Prime Minister saying what he says and saying the kind of support that they are going to give it. We have seen the other European powers. Of course, the Romanians have stood out in rejecting what was happening, and they have said, we are supporting this administration. And I have no doubt in my mind that they share intelligence with the Ukrainians. So all those factors must be seen in the historical context, that the world from a Western perspective was always bad guys and good guys, and they are the good guys. And of course, if you don't play ball, then you are the bad guys. Israel, on the other hand, must be seen in the context of the Balfour Agreements in 1900s. And you remember, somebody once said that all the problems of the world are actually traceable to the British. When in 1948, the Israeli state as we know it was created, it would have been easier at that time to actually create two states, a Jewish state and a Palestinian state. But the decision was made that they were to create this Jewish state, and we know what happened with the Nakba. And after that, we know the activities that took place leading up to the Oslo Accords, where it was agreed that there would be a two-state solution. The two-state solution is no longer on the table. And Israel has been marketed and depicted as the bastion of democracy in what is otherwise an ocean of feudal monarchies and dictatorships. And therefore Europe, or rather Israel, is seen as this beloved country. And the Israelis themselves have not hesitated to go back to history and to go back to the Torah and say that we are chosen of God. And because we are chosen of God, we are different, we are unique. And because we are unique, we must be treated differently. And America, which has underwritten the state of Israel from its creation in 1948, has reinforced this, so that the Israelis actually believe that they are special. They believe that they can do no wrong. They believe that they are God-guided. So when you are dealing with the people who believe that they are undertaking a divine mission, then the first casualty is logic. And when logic has been sacrificed at the altar of mysticism, then your journey is very short, and your reasoning is also not given any space at all. Your reasoning has the chance of a snowball in hell, and that is where we find ourselves. And lastly, you must also remember that we are dealing with a Western world whose power and influence is diminishing. Like it or not, it may take many years, but the global South is awake, and that global South is saying that the time is now for us to be heard, and heard clearly. The demography of the world is changing. Europe is becoming older and older population, and they are scared. They are scared That is from a Western perspective. If you ask many Africans, many in the African continent, they are casting their lot with Vladimir Putin. They are saying that Putin is simply using the same thing that the Israelis do, because the Israelis gave birth to this concept of preemptive defense. It is exactly the same thing that Putin said. I'm defending our country preemptively, because if I don't, we will be attacked sooner rather than later. So the Israelis attacked Iran on the basis of preemptive defense. So, and Nelson Mandela put it very well at one time when he was confronted with this question. He says, these fellows, when they don't want you under your freedom fighter, they call you a terrorist. And yet, the truth is, all freedom fighters are labeled terrorists, because the Western world long recognized if you want to kill a dog, you give it a bad name, then you proceed to kill it. So from where I sit, there is nothing that is happening that is bad from Russia. The only thing is we must agree. War is a bad thing. It is a bad thing because young men and women die. It is a bad thing because everybody suffers, both those who are wronged and those who have committed the wrong. So nobody really wants war. War is last resort. And if you ask any of these war generals, their preferred position is, let us never get to war. But don't listen too much. Let us not listen too much to Western analysts whose only agenda is defined by one thing. We are good, they are bad. And if we say they are bad, say yeah. And we say they are good, agree with us. That kind of approach has no place in the civilized world. You know, the Israeli conflict with Iran and the fact that there is a deafening silence from the West, and which is actually complicit, takes away their high moral stance that they had with regard to the war between Russia and Ukraine. The same arguments are no longer available to them. And in the last 1 week, when the Israelis have been jousting with the Iranians, you no longer hear as loudly as it was that the Russians are bombarding Kiev. In fact, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine is no longer occupy acres and acres of space in the newspapers as it was 2 weeks ago, because it has taken away the moral argument that the conceptual West had. And that is why you can see now they are a little bit slow to judge, or even if they are doing so, they are not doing it as loudly and as boldly as they were doing, which is good. It is good because it is creating an environment where, in fact, all combatants, all parties who are involved in conflict can be brought to the negotiating table. It is a bad route to take, but I think it is the route that has been taken. And sometimes there is a storm before the lull. I hope and pray that this storm between Iran and Israel is the storm that will create a lull which will lead to peace, even if it is merely a modus vivendi where people live and let live without permanent peace. It will be good for the world to reassess, and to reassess the institutions that were created after the World War II, to look at the UN Charter again, to look at the architecture of the United Nations again. I think for the first time since the World War II, all these institutions are being reassessed. The International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. All these are now under scrutiny because it would appear to me that the 21st century and the conflicts that have arisen require different approaches going forward. We are fighting at a time where fights are not even, there are no men and women in boots on the ground. Drones have taken space, ballistic missiles. How do you prosecute this war? How do you deal with it in the context of the instruments that we have, which were created after World War II? Many questions, begging many answers, and it will take bold people, bold leadership at the political level to arrive at the desired destination. The question as to what could happen if the Ayatollahs are removed is one that does not lend itself to easy answers. But there are things that tell us how dangerous and how confused it could be. Look at Libya post-Gaddafi. One would have thought that after Gaddafi, then Libya would be El Dorado, the land of gold. We now know and see the confusion. See Iraq after Saddam Hussein. One would have thought that after Saddam, you'd have a regime that responds to the West in the manner that the West wants. See Syria after Assad, and look at the situation. There may be stability in and around Damascus, but what about the rest of Syria? And I dare say that Iran could be a lot more complex because you have people who are inclined toward the theocratic regime, which is Shia Muslim of their own kind. There are people who are remnants of the Pahlavi dynasty. And all these factors which we thought were dead were possibly in a state of comatose. And if they arise and they are armed, we could see in Iran a civil war. We could see in Iran what we are seeing in Afghanistan. Those are the possibilities, those are the scenarios that lend themselves to being taken into consideration if the Ayatollahs were to leave the scene.